Co-chair of the College Republicans, along with Catherine McGinnis, and we're the proud co-sponsors of tonight's talk. So, for those that don't know, we are 93 members now, and we meet every 2 weeks. Our main goal as a club is to promote intellectual diversity, and that's the main purpose of this talk tonight. So, thank you to Nate Hinson, the student activities fund and the department for all the support as always. So Oren Cass is a senior fellow of the Manhattan Institute, where his work on strengthening the labor market addresses issues ranging from the social safety net and environmental regulation to trade and immigration to education and organized labor. He also writes extensively on the nature and implications of climate change and on the process of formulating and evaluating public policy. Cass has written for publications including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, National Affairs, and the National Review. He regularly speaks at universities and testifies before Congress. His 2018 book, The Once and Future Worker, A Vision for the Renewal of Work in America, has been called the essential policy book for our time and an unflinching indictment of the mistakes that Washington has made for a generation and continues to make today. Before joining the Manhattan Institute, he held roles as a domestic policy director for Mitt Romney's presidential campaign in 2012, as an editor of the Harvard Law Review, and as a management consultant at Bain Company's Boston and New Delhi offices. He earned a BA in political economy from Williams College and a JD from Harvard Law School. Just some two brief quotes about his book, the topic of discussion tonight. One's by David Brooks, New York Times columnist. Working class voters tried to send a message in 2016, and they are still trying to send it. The crucial question is whether America's leaders will listen and respond. One way to start doing that is to read Oren Cass's absolutely brilliant new book. Another blurb by Jason Furman, chairman of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. He says, "A thoughtful, provocative, carefully argued book that made me change my mind on issues that I thought I'd thought about quite a while." So that gives you an idea of tonight's discussion. It's my honor to introduce Mr. Oren Cass.
Very much. Well, thank you guys for coming. Thank you for hosting me. When you said you were going to read two quotes, I assumed that would be a good one and then a terrible one to sort of lay it out. At one point last month, in 1 week, I was called a Marxist, compared to Mussolini, and accused of wanting to bring back the Jim Crow South. So I'll talk about the book and let you be the judge of how many of those are accurate. The Marxist one is definitely closest, at least. But the way I like to start talking about this subject is with a really nice chart that the New York Times put in one of their interactive features recently. And what it had was a map of the United States with each county shaded by what share of personal income in the county came from government transfer payments. So 10% would mean about 1 in every $10 earned in the county was actually a government transfer. And it shows that map in 1974. And pretty much the whole map is kind of light beige, light pink, which represented kind of 10 to 20% transfer payments. And then it showed the map in 2015. And the map is a darker shade of red, except in certain coastal cities, with blotches of bright purple in the middle representing actually greater than 50%. So the majority of income in the county actually coming from government transfers. And the interesting thing about that map is I think it provides a really nice Rorschach test for how we think about our economic success in recent decades. Because if you think about how we've talked about public policy, the basic premise has been we're going to grow the economy as quickly as we can, and then we're going to redistribute from the winners to any losers so that everybody can actually be better off. And during that same period, the economy has grown incredibly. GDP is about 3 times higher in 2015 than it was in 1974. So in a sense, that map actually represents a massive success. That it is exactly a depiction of what we said we were going to do. We were going to grow GDP rapidly, and we were going to redistribute to anybody who was left behind. If you believe that was right, then you would in fact have expected the map to get much, much darker red over time. And yet when we look at that map, I don't think we're especially pleased with it. I think we recognize that any part of the country that becomes so heavily reliant on transfer payments, and especially large swaths heavily reliant, represents a very major failing and a pretty serious problem for the country. And so I think it's important to contemplate why. Essentially, we're akin to the romantic comedy heroine, who, in the trailer, they say she had it all, or so she thought, ... And she's got the nice car and the apartment and all of these things, and yet somehow she's not happy. Somehow she missed something along the way. And I think it's important to emphasize that in consumption terms, in terms of material living standards, pretty much everybody across the country is better off. Even the people in those dark purple swaths, if we're only asking how much they can consume, what their material living standard is, it is actually much higher in 2015 than in 1975. And yet we missed something. Now, what did we get wrong? I think it goes all the way back to Adam Smith. And so I'll read this quote. It's from The Wealth of Nations, in which Smith writes, "Consumption is the sole end purpose of all production, and the interest of the producer ought to be attended to only so far as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer. The maxim is so perfectly self-evident that it would be absurd to attempt to prove it." Now, first rule, if you have to end your maxim with, "This is so self-evident I don't have to prove it," there might be something wrong with your maxim. But this is the model on which modern economics and public policy is built. It is a model that emphasizes and focuses only on consumer welfare. And the idea is that whatever makes consumer welfare the highest is the best. And what that really built to in the United States was this idea of the economic pie. If you pay any attention to politics, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, you've heard the term economic pie. It was actually Harry Truman was the first president to use it, and almost every president since, Democrat and Republican, has talked about growing the economic pie. New York Times and Wall Street Journal editorial boards both talk about growing the economic pie. Left of center, right of center think tanks, everyone talks about growing the economic pie. And the intuition behind the pie metaphor is that as long as the pie keeps getting bigger, everybody can have a bigger slice. And if some people don't end up with bigger slices, we can always kind of cut some of the pie and take it off of one plate and put it on another, and then everybody will have a bigger slice. And at the end of the day, who doesn't like pie? But here's what I think it misses. I think what it misses, to take the metaphor much too far, is that we actually care a lot about who bakes the pie. Now, when we're talking about what both drives people's own satisfaction and happiness with their lives, and more importantly, when we're talking about what provides the foundation for healthy families and communities, and for a healthy economy over time, consumption actually isn't the most important thing. Production and having a role as a productive contributor to a community, to a society, being able to achieve self-sufficiency and provide for a family, actually are much more important. And so what I propose is what I call the working hypothesis. I wanted to call my book The Working Hypothesis. I thought it had like an edgy Jason Bourne thriller kind of feel. The publisher said it had like a boring, no one wants to read it book kind of feel. But I called the introduction The Working Hypothesis because you get to name your own introduction. And the working hypothesis is this. It's that a labor market in which people can support healthy families and communities is the fundamental driver of prosperity and should be the fundamental goal of public policy. And so I'm not going to necessarily persuade you of all these things, but I'd like to at least get you to consider three things tonight about that. First of all, how is that really pretty significantly different? It sounds like common sense, but how is it really very different from how we've been going about things? Why might it actually be true, which I suppose is important? And then what does it imply for how we approach politics and what kind of policies we might want to pursue? So how is it different? If you think about the economic pie model for society, for what we're trying to achieve, we are focused entirely on the aggregate. We are focused on net gains and the idea that we are happy producing both winners and losers as long as the gains to the winners are larger than the losses to the losers. Because if nothing else, on net we're better off. In principle, we can actually take from the winners and give to the losers. Whether or not we actually do that is really a separate question. If you take the working hypothesis seriously, you realize that there's actually some sort of baseline under which we're not going to accept losses for the losers. That pushing losers below the level of self-sufficiency is actually not acceptable, even if it comes with pretty large gains for the winners. And I think you can make that case in moral terms, but you can also make it in economic terms, which is to say that there are really diminishing marginal gains to becoming an ever bigger winner, and there are, in a sense, ever expanding losses to becoming an ever bigger loser. If you have folks who are earning $200,000 a year and their earnings go up to $300,000 a year, while at the other end, people who were earning $30,000 go down to $20,000, basic economics would say that's a huge win. But the likelihood is that actually the improvements you've made in the lives of the people going from 200 to 300,000 are not nearly as large as the damage you've caused in the lives going from 30 to 20,000. So that's one consideration we should have. A second consideration we should have is how we think about economic growth. The way that we have typically approached economic growth is to think that if we can get that right, good things will flow from it. That if we can get the economy growing, we will have all the other nice things, whether it's higher consumption, healthy families, great communities. The growth is sort of the prerequisite for it. The working hypothesis pretty much flips that and says that's backward. Economic growth isn't something you just get with a set of policy levers. Economic growth is more so an emergent property. Economic growth is what happens when you have a healthy society, when you have families that are able to raise kids, to be productive members of society, where you have communities in which people can build businesses in the first place. And so the working hypothesis says instead of just focusing on the growth and counting on everything else to come, let's actually make our priority the institutions at the foundation of society and count on the growth to come from that. And in colloquial terms, I would say the easiest way to distinguish it is economic pie is built around the idea that I want to have an iPhone, and the working hypothesis is built around the idea that maybe we should actually be making the iPhone. So that's why it's different. Why is it true, which is probably the most important piece of all this? There are two reasons it's true. One is that work is really important, and one is that actually the market's not going to solve this on its own. Work, in sort of moral terms and religious terms, often gets elevated pretty substantially. And one of the things I've been most struck by in the response to my work is there have actually been a lot of folks, particularly in the Christian community, who have sort of picked it up and said, this is a really interesting Christian message, and talked about how it relates to Scripture and particularly certain elements of Catholic teaching. And I must confess I'm fascinated by that, and I'm learning about it as quickly as I can, but I don't actually know anything about it, and it's not where I'm arguing from. I'm most interested in concrete social science implications of work. And first of all, work for the individual. So we actually have a lot of very good evidence that being employed, being a productive worker, is critically important to people's self-esteem, to people's mental health, and to people's happiness. And happiness is squishy. Most happiness studies are not good. But good happiness studies actually look at the same person over very long periods of time. Because if you do that, you have a baseline to compare. And those studies show us two really interesting things. One is that we all sort of have our own pre-existing level of happiness, whether it's genetically or otherwise determined. Some of you are just happier than others. Some of you, asked to rate how happy you are going to give a 9. Some of you are more going to be feeling a 7. And it turns out that that pretty much stays no matter what happens to you. So you can see the effect of birth, death, marriage, divorce, permanent disability. All of these things cause blips. When they're happening to you, you feel much more or less happy. But remarkably quickly, people actually adapt and return to their pre-existing level of happiness. So that's interesting. The second really interesting thing is that in all of the literature, the only thing we don't get used to is not working. People who move from work to not work and don't find work again move to a permanently lower level of life satisfaction that they never recover from. So that's not dispositive, but I think it's relevant. And then the last component for individuals is to keep in mind that productive work is the only way to actually move forward in one's life. We can sustain people at any given material living standard through transfers, but we're going to have to do it again the next year. If anything, their own capacities are probably going to erode. It's only through working that you actually create opportunity for yourself to move up. And so any economic model that's not based on people being engaged in work in the first place is going to be one that has very concerning consequences for people's individual trajectories. So I think work is important for individuals, but if we were only talking about the individual, you could probably make a case that the consumer welfare side matters at least as much. Where the case for work is most important is when you move up from the individual to the social institutions that the individuals rely on. So first of all, the family. Work is incredibly important to family formation and to family stability. And this is the case especially for men. But when men have work and well-paying work, more families form, more people get married. And even more strongly, when people, and men in particular, lose work, when they become unemployed, divorce skyrockets. Unemployment is an incredibly strong predictor of divorce, really order of magnitude greater effect than most of the things that you would see in the social science. And then work is critical for kids. Kids tend to have better outcomes growing up in households where the adults are working. And even more broadly, kids tend to have better outcomes just growing up in communities where other adults are working. Charles Murray in Coming Apart, who did a lot of very important work documenting all sorts of corrosion in measures of social health, specifically among the working class. And one of the most stunning things he found is that by 2010, so this is sort of in the aftermath of the recession, among the working class cohort he was focused on, only 51% of households had a full-time worker. That's not two people working, that's had a full-time worker in the household. And it turns out that communities like that are ones that kids coming from struggle, even after you try to hold constant as many other things as you can. So work is important for family, and then work is also important for those communities. Work is a nexus of community. Work is the means by which people get up and engage in the real world for the most part, forcing people to actually consider the needs of others, forcing people to actually meet obligations and so forth in a lot of cases. Work is also something that fosters community. When you have a productive economy with people contributing to it, you get more investment in social services, in housing and so forth. When you don't have work, you have a lot of the converse. You have more addiction, you have more crime. And then the last thing that's critical about work for communities is that every community has to make something. Okay, it's become fashionable to speak about the way people obsess over manufacturing jobs and think that that's sort of archaic or nostalgic or unsophisticated. Manufacturing is really, really uniquely important as an economic activity because along with a few other things, it's the only way to make tradables, things that you can actually make in one place and send elsewhere. And you need to do that because you want elsewhere to send a whole lot of things to you. Okay, every community is relying for its energy, its cars, its medical devices, its, you name it, to come from elsewhere. And so while you can move to a services economy, maybe where 80% of the jobs are in the services sector, you can't all serve each other coffee. And if you get to a situation where you are all serving each other coffee, where your community does not make anything that the rest of the world wants, your only option for getting things from the rest of the world is to do what I call exporting need. So if you think back to that map with all the dark purple shading, if you don't make anything the rest of the world wants, you can get what you need from the rest of the world in the form of government transfers. Okay? If you go to Maine is a good example of this. If you go drive around a really distressed community, you'll find a dilapidated shopping plaza. And in the middle of it, you might see a sparkling occupational therapy office. And you say, what is that doing there? The occupational therapy office is the town's exporter. It is exporting to the nation's taxpayers care of the people in the town on disability. The Obama administration actually made this explicit. It had a brochure encouraging people to sign up for food stamps, emphasizing that it's not just that the food stamps benefit you as the recipient, they also benefit local retailers, and they have a multiplier effect in the community, because this is actually a way to boost vitality in communities that don't have actual productive industry. And ultimately, you see it in how we talk about the healthcare sector generally. There's an incredible amount of enthusiasm for healthcare as the one industry that seems to thrive everywhere. And we draw from that some sort of conclusion that it must be a really robust and dynamic industry. That's not true. The reason healthcare thrives everywhere is because we have open-ended federal entitlement programs that commit to paying any healthcare institution for essentially any care it provides to anybody. And so you can have a very distressed community, but the people in that community are now eligible for public health assistance, and so they can now go to the health facility and get that care, and the payments come in from elsewhere. Now, as we saw from that map, you can in fact operate an economy like that, but it's a really, really bad model for it, and it's one that's on a downward trajectory, and it's certainly not one that's sustainable over time. And then the final reason I think that work is so important is that production actually matters to the economy. That sounds either circular or blindingly obvious, depending on how you look at it. But our economy's trajectory over time actually depends tremendously on what investments we choose to make and what things we choose to do at a point in time. Based on the focus solely on consumer welfare, it has been the official public policy of the United States and the black letter guidance of economics that it does not matter what you make in a place. George H.W. Bush's chair of his Council of Economic Advisors famously said, "Potato chips, computer chips, what's the difference?" Talking about whether we should care and why we shouldn't care that all of the electronics manufacturing was working overseas. Obama's chair said virtually the same thing. She said, hairdressers, haircuts. Hair dryers, haircuts. What's the difference? The answer is that there's a huge difference. That what you make, what you invest in, what supply chains and expertise you build at any point in time is hugely influential on your economy's trajectory over time. And we now face this situation where when people ask, well, why can't we make things here? The same people who said, well, it doesn't matter what we make here, it doesn't matter if it leaves, now say, well, we can't make it here because all of the supply chains and expertise are somewhere else. And that's one of those real kind of facepalm moments. But it's something that we truly did not pay attention to and didn't concern ourselves with. We said, if the TV from China is cheaper, we should celebrate. There was a wonderful story in the New York Times that I think drove this home. It was maybe 2 weeks ago. It was talking about Apple's attempt to actually manufacture something in the US a few years ago. The reason they couldn't wasn't labor costs. It was that they literally couldn't find enough screws. And on the one hand, you're like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. You can't find enough screws. But in fact, machining massive numbers of very precise screws on demand as manufacturing requirements change is really hard. And in China, it's easy to do. And in Texas, they couldn't get enough. And those are the challenges we actually face here now because we never worried about it along the way. So that's part one of why this is true. It actually matters that people are productive. It matters that families and communities are supported by productive activity. It matters that our economy is built on the kinds of industries that are actually going to grow and thrive over time. The second related point, and this is something that I think folks on the right of center especially have to grapple with, is that markets aren't going to solve this for us. Markets are good at something in particular, which is delivering efficient outcomes, okay? Markets will take the conditions they operate in, and they will spit out an efficient answer. If we have a particular social preference for some answer, there's no reason to expect that that's the one we're going to get. There's nothing in economics that says that the equilibrium the labor market is going to reach is going to be one in which people of all aptitudes in all places can actually support healthy families and communities. Now, if all you care about is efficiency, if all you care about is maximizing growth, and then want to redistribute it in the back end, that's fine. You treat the labor market like any other market. You not just figuratively, but you literally write off the excess workers who the market doesn't want. But if you actually say, no, we think both for our long-term economic health and for other social reasons, we don't like that market outcome, we want a different one, then you can't rely solely on all of the principles that tell us that markets are going to deliver good results. You actually have to do something about it. So what does all of this imply? What would it mean to actually take the working hypothesis seriously and say that instead of just growing the economic pie, we're going to focus our economic policy on the health of the labor market? I think it means a few interesting things. One is it creates a really, really interesting split within the right of center, which we are living through right now. The right of center coalition that we are used to and have had since at least the 1960s is an alliance between conservatives and libertarians. And conservatives and libertarians both really like markets for all sorts of reasons, especially when you're fighting the communists. But they actually think fairly differently about markets. For conservatives, markets are a means to an end. Markets are a terrific way to build and achieve a flourishing society. For libertarians, markets are more an end unto themselves. The whole point is to have a free market, and whatever answer the market delivers is the one that you want. And for a long time, I think the results that we were getting from the market were ones that supported a flourishing society, and so conservatives and libertarians sort of just thought they agreed. But we've reached a point where that's not what we're seeing. We've reached a point where the outcomes being delivered in the labor market in particular are not ones that are supporting healthy families and communities across the nation. And all of a sudden you have conservatives and libertarians who thought they agreed on everything realizing that actually they don't. That they take a very different view about what to do given that situation. And I think a good way to understand President Trump's rise through the Republican Party was that he essentially just sort of jammed his thumb right into that wound. I don't think you would necessarily describe him as a conservative or as a libertarian, but in a party that thought that the answer was still, well, the market's going to solve this, he really emerged and talked about the things that the market wasn't solving. And I think that appealed to a whole lot of people who saw the market failing to deliver what had been promised. So that's one interesting thing that we're grappling with right now. A second interesting thing that I think is really important to realize is that, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things about the economic pie is that you only have to think about the aggregate. As long as growth overall is good, as long as the economy overall gets bigger, you declare success. And because you're talking in consumer terms, if some people have more or less, you can redistribute the money around. It's a very sort of mechanical view of society. If you actually care about productive activity, about work, it becomes a lot harder. You can't redistribute that the way that you can redistribute consumption. And you can't just count on everybody having fungible dollars to then go buy whatever they want. So you have to be concerned a lot more about pluralism. You have to be concerned a lot more about the idea that people actually have different aptitudes, they actually want different things, they actually come from different places, and for the most part want to stay in those places. And all of those things count if you're not just talking about consumer welfare. And so the sort of test that I like to give folks that produces some really striking answers is I offer a hypothetical, which is there you sort of have a big red button, and it says 20% on it. And if you push the big red button, the top 20% of the labor force, the most productive 20%, is going to instantly become twice as productive. The bottom 20% is going to drop out entirely. Now, the top 20% is more productive to begin with. So if you double their productivity and you lose the bottom 20%, your aggregate productivity is going to go up. Your economy is going to be larger. And I'll even let you stipulate that you're going to have some great redistribution program that mails the balance to the losers to hold them harmless. Do you push the button? So like, I don't know, show of hands, who in here would push the button? Got a couple people. I knew he was going to eventually raise his hand, but I thought he'd have to think about it a little. When you pose this question, what I've found generally is there are people who are very happy to say no, about half. And there are people, a few will say yes, and then a lot will really fight the hypothetical. And there are all sorts of ways to fight the hypothetical. It's a silly hypothetical. But there's something in our intuition that makes us less comfortable saying yes. There are plenty of arguments for saying yes. It's the way we've run our economic policy for the last 50 years, by the way. So that's a good reason to say yes. But there's something about that that makes us really uncomfortable, because viewing our economy in the aggregate doesn't actually reflect lived reality or necessarily how we want to build society. And so it's not just about productivity, it's also about pluralism. It's about building an economy that's going to support people in the lives that they want to build, in the places they want to build them, and not just saying, well, if you became a welder in Houston, you'd be doing fine. Because like on the one hand, yeah, that's true. There are lots of good welding jobs available in Houston. But that's not actually responsive to what we want a flourishing society to look like. And then the last really important implication I think it has is that it really forces us to take a different approach to the challenges that we face as a society. I think most people at this point agree that we have a fairly significant segment of our population that's really falling behind in a concerning way, or has been left behind. And it equates roughly to the 50% of the population that doesn't complete higher education. If you think about what answers we like to give to that problem, one of them is, well, we have to build a bigger safety net. And that's what we've just been talking about. Can we just redistribute to the people left behind and make them whole that way? And I would say the answer is no. The second thing we talk about, and I just alluded to this in the pluralism context, is, well, everyone just needs to move. If you're in a place that's not thriving, there are good jobs somewhere else, so you should move there. There are economists who have built models to show how much higher GDP would be if like everyone in the country lived in San Francisco. It's like, well, first of all, there are probably some questionable assumptions in there. But second of all, is that like even a useful thing to think about? Because we have this idea that the American ideal is, you know, moving to opportunity. And in fact, we've seen a decline in people moving to opportunity that really concerns us. And it's true that that has always been part of the American ethos, to push out the frontier, to move somewhere. But it's equally true that getting to stay where you are has been part of the American ethos. You know, of all the things I talk about on college campuses, the single fact that most blows people's minds, so get ready, is that the median American adult lives 18 miles from his mother. Okay? So most Americans live within 18 miles of their mother. An even higher share, I believe it's going on 80%, live within about 2 hours of where they grew up. The idea that, like, you know, well, you go to college over here, then you move to this city, like maybe you say you want to move back home from someday, but let's be honest, what would you do there? Like, that's not the norm. It doesn't appear to be what most people want. And it doesn't appear ever to have been what most people want. If you even look at Oklahoma during the 1930s, the famous Dust Bowl with the Okies going to California, the population of Oklahoma dropped less than 3% in the 1930s. Farmers were actually least likely to leave. And actually, almost the entire decline was not a function of higher levels of out-migration, but lower levels of in-migration. So yeah, fewer people moved to Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl. But it's not the case that like half the people got up and left. A state like Maine, which has faced rapid deindustrialization, has actually grown its population every single decade since the late 1800s. Iowa, as it went through the mechanization of agriculture, grew its population every decade from 1880 to 1980. So we don't actually just pick up people and move them. Our economy has always been one that provided opportunity where people were. And even if you could massively expand the rate of moving, let's say you're like, we're going to get 20% of the people to pick up and move, you'd still have 80% there. And you probably would have just picked up and moved the folks with the most initiative, the most social capital, the most capacity to build something in their own communities. So you'd actually have made your problem worse. So whatever our solution is, it's ultimately going to have to be one that brings opportunity to the places where people are and doesn't just offer them the chance to go elsewhere. And then finally, we love to talk about education, right? Well, if we had a better education system, surely we would solve this problem. I am all for a better education system, and I think we should pursue whatever education reforms we can think of, but we have to acknowledge how extraordinarily ineffective our efforts at education reform have been. Okay? Since the 1970s, we have doubled per pupil spending. Test scores have not moved. Standardized test scores for 17-year-olds are no higher now than they were in the 1970s. SAT scores are lower. That's partly a function of more people taking it than used to, but it's not like we're cranking out some new, more college-ready cohort. And in fact, if you look at the share that achieves a bachelor's degree by the age of 25, it hasn't moved in 2 generations. Went up a couple of points and then down a couple points, but we're within a couple of points of where we were in the 70s. And even if you look over people's lifetime, and including all community college degrees, most people in America still won't earn even a community college degree. So again, all for education reform, all for seeing if we can move that needle over the time. But the idea that we're going to fix it that way, or that everyone should just sort of like hang on while we get this right, is deeply, deeply misguided, I think. And the last thing I would observe about all 3 of those mechanisms, and the reason they're what we talk about, is that they're actually really, really painless for the people who are winning. Okay? We've sort of built this model of like, what does it mean to be compassionate and socially responsible and so forth. But somehow we've equated it to like, who supports paying higher taxes and bigger government programs? And hey, look, if you've got a government program that's going to do anything effective, let's talk about funding it. But that's not actually what the folks who are falling behind need. And Joe Biden famously loved to say, don't tell me your values, show me your budget and I'll tell you your values. It's like, yeah, like, no, that's a ridiculous thing to say. Like, how much you're willing to pay in taxes tells me your values. Again, like, oh, well, the person earning $300,000 says he's okay with $200,000. That form of redistribution turns out to be the least costly thing imaginable for folks who are getting ahead. And likewise, the idea of relocation or the idea of education essentially amounts to saying, well, we can't do anything about the education, about the economy and society we've built. We really like it. How can we turn everybody into things that are going to fit what we have and like? And it's not going to work. We're actually going to have to talk about how do we change things about our economy and society to actually fit the people that we have. And so when we talk about what do we do about this, how should we think about it, I think it all comes back to this idea of the labor market. And again, the labor market is a market. It's going to take the conditions that it's operating in, and it's going to spit out an answer. And the right of center view of just trust the market to deliver a great result isn't sufficient. The left of center view of like, well, let's yell at the market to do something different isn't much of a solution. If we want a different outcome, we're actually going to have to look at the conditions it's operating in. And so there are a whole bunch of different dimensions we can talk about, and I'll mention them briefly, and then in the Q&A, happy to talk more about any that you're interested in. But they basically come down to the different components of the market. So what determines demand for labor? What determines what kind of businesses get built, where investment occurs? Obviously, a whole bunch of things do, but one that's incredibly important is our regulatory environment. We have taken an approach to regulation over the last 40 or 50 years that has made it incredibly, incredibly difficult to do anything in the physical world, and made it incredibly, incredibly easy to do things in the financial and technological worlds. I don't think we should be surprised that all of the investment and innovation and entrepreneurship has flowed to the things that generate high returns with low risk and less effort and cost. The problem is that those things that you do in the actual physical world turn out to be the things at which particularly less educated men have a comparative advantage doing. Again, we don't cling to manufacturing nostalgically. It actually matters for communities. It also turns out to be the place where men without college educations can earn the most money and be the most productive, and where you can get the most productivity gains over time. Okay? I believe it's now the majority, or close to a majority, of the jobs for blue-collar men paying more than $15 an hour, even now, are manufacturing, construction, and resource extraction. Not a coincidence, and it's exactly the types of activity that we've made as hard as possible. And so we could choose a different approach. From the supply side, who we're providing to the labor market, we could really think about what we focus on in our education system. We've built this kind of college for all model that says we're going to have a pipeline that pushes as many people through college as possible. And yeah, a lot are going to fall out along the way, but the ones who come out, boy, are they going to be successful and drive our economic growth. And when you look at each segment of our pipeline, it can look okay. Most people graduate from high school. Most people who graduate from high school go to college. Most people who go to college complete college. Most people who complete college end up with a job that actually requires a degree. But if you look in the negative space behind all of those mosts, you actually find 80% of the population in them. Fewer than 1 in 5 people are actually going smoothly high school to college to career. And yet that's essentially the only model that we celebrate. It's the only one that we fund. We put more than $150 billion a year into subsidizing higher education. If you don't go into higher education, you get zero, right? Even though the people who are actually going to be successful in higher education are the ones who we expect to be the economic winners. So you could actually shift that calculus. You could say, no, we're going to build a pathway for the other half of folks, and we're going to give that at least as much attention and resources. And we're actually going to make that something that you would rationally want to choose and be excited about if you were someone who was less likely to succeed. We have to really think how we talk about trade and immigration. From a consumer welfare perspective, more trade, more immigration are always better. They reduce prices, they increase choice. What could be wrong? From a labor market perspective, it's a lot more complicated. Balance actually really matters. If you have a trade imbalance, if you are importing massive amounts of stuff and not exporting anything, that's essentially another way of saying you've allowed massive numbers of additional workers into your labor market on the supply side to do the work, and you haven't actually created any additional demand for the workers you have here. And that's what we've seen. And immigration, likewise, is a really interesting question of balance, given the types of skills that immigrants have. You know, each immigrant who enters the labor market enters only one segment of the labor market himself, but also brings along demand across all segments of the market. And so when you introduce a bunch of high-skilled immigrants, you bring a lot more competition to the high-skilled segment of the labor market on the supply side, and lots more demand for everybody's work. Low-skilled immigrants do the converse. And if you think one of the biggest problems you have in your society is an excess of supply and dearth of opportunities for less skilled workers, adding to that supply is not a good choice. Again, it's great for consumers, it's going to lower prices, it's going to grow GDP. It's not going to generate better labor market outcomes for the workers who are here. Last two things I'm going to mention. One is organized labor, which is something I think both left and right have done just an enormous disservice to. The left has this model of kind of a 1930s style labor unions that have not worked for a long time and are dying out, but they fund the Democratic Party, and so they've been defending them literally to the death. The right thinks organized labor stinks because it raises costs for business, and so they just sort of cheer as it dies. The organized labor system that we have from the Great Depression is not appropriate or effective or constructive for workers or firms right now. But a system of organized labor, the idea that workers should be able to organize, that they should be able to represent their collective interests, that they should be able to work on each other's behalf, that's a really good idea. We should want that, conservatives should want that, liberals should want to see that work better. And by the way, the rest of the world has systems like that that look completely different from ours. And so that's something we need to focus on. And then finally, as we think about how our safety net operates, we've built a safety net. We spend more than $1 trillion a year redistributing resources to lower income households. Virtually none of it takes any consideration of work. Most of it actively discourages work. You lose your benefits as you start to work. And so we still need a lot of that. We need a safety net for a lot of folks who can't work for a lot of reasons. But some share of it should actually go to promoting work and to putting money in the paychecks of people who are working. And so the idea that I like to talk about is what's called a wage subsidy. It's just like on your paycheck, you've got FICA that takes out the payroll taxes. There could be a line under it that says work credit. And for workers earning below a certain hourly wage, there could be money going right back into the check. And so an $8 an hour job could become an $11 an hour job. And if you do that, you make the jobs more attractive for lower income workers to take and come into the market. You make it more attractive for employers to actually create those kind of jobs and use those kinds of workers. And then at the end of the day, you also get more resources into the hands of low-income households, but in a form that's actually attached to the work that they've done. And so all of those kinds of policies, with the exception of the wage subsidy, which is really just a reform, are, I would argue, a different kind of redistribution. They are not redistribution of dollars from group A to group B. They are a reorienting of some of our societal institutions in ways that are actually going to benefit the folks who have been falling behind at the expense of those who have been getting ahead. And so it's not surprising that those have not been popular proposals necessarily among those who like to offer proposals. But I think they have a much better chance of succeeding and making a real difference in the trajectory of the economy. And ultimately, I think we have to recognize that as we've started to see, a miserable majority is everybody's problem. That the course we are on is just not a sustainable one. And that making some essentially concessions now, reorienting a society to be more appropriate to, say, the median American is ultimately going to redound to the benefit of all of us. Thank you very much. Now I guess I'll just answer any questions anybody has. So it's a great question. I think it's a terrible policy idea. There have been some proposals along those lines. Some are very targeted, like you have people who say like we should ban self-driving cars, right? It would be a very easy regulatory thing to do, and that would save truck driver jobs. You could also more generally do something. It was actually Bill Gates who at one point proposed a robot tax to tax more heavily the use of capital than the use of labor in a way. The problem with doing that kind of thing is I think we have to recognize that at the end of the day, technology has to be part of the solution. That when we're talking about how the labor market operates, how less skilled workers can earn more money, the formula has to be their productivity increasing, which by definition means them using more technology and us doing more automation. And the way to think about this is to realize that what we call destroying jobs actually is productivity gain. So think of a group of 10 workers who each crank out a widget a day. And now imagine we could double their productivity so they each could crank out 2 widgets a day. Like that sounds terrific. It's also another way of saying like, well, now you only need 5 workers to crank out your 10 widgets a day. And what's happened in our economy over time is that the model we used to pursue was that first one. As productivity gained, as you started making more widgets with your 10 workers, you kept the 10 workers and they made more widgets. So productivity growth tended to be pretty good, and output growth ran in parallel with it. So if you look in sort of what folks think of as the golden age of like 1946 to 1973, productivity doubled and wages roughly doubled as well. And there was no decline in, for instance, manufacturing employment. What has changed in recent decades isn't that we're suddenly automating more quickly and throwing people out of work that way. We're actually automating more slowly. Productivity growth the last few years has been the lowest on record. But what's changed is that output growth has stopped. So all of the loss of manufacturing jobs wasn't because we started automating more quickly. It was because we stopped making more stuff as we automated. And so we shifted from that 10 workers making 20 widgets to, well, now we only need 5 workers to make the 10 widgets. And if we'd actually kept output growing as fast as it had been, if output since 2000 had continued growing as fast as it did during 1950 to 2000, we would actually have more manufacturing workers today than we had in 2000. So that's all a long way of saying automating things isn't inherently good or bad for workers. The question is what else is going on. And on the flip side, not automating is a disaster for workers. They can't become more productive. And whether you're talking about automation in terms of machines, even just education and skills. If you give workers skills to make them more productive, you could also say you're destroying jobs. But hopefully you're not if the labor market is functioning well. And so I think the solution has to be to celebrate and embrace technological progress, but try to get it back to operating in the kind of labor market where it's accruing to the benefit of workers instead of being a way to use fewer of them. Yeah, sure. So universal service can kind of mean two things. There's one is sort of the national service model, which is like either like an optional, hey, here's like for a year you can come do this if you want, or more of like a everybody between the ages of 18 and 19 or 18 and 20 has to be in this program akin to universal military service, and we're going to use that to sort of both have more of a cultural melting pot and address various pressing challenges and so forth. National service is an idea that I think is enormously appealing in principle and incredibly, incredibly difficult in practice. It turns out that there aren't a whole lot of useful things to do with like young people who you know you're only going to have for a year or two outside of like the military context, and especially when like you don't get to do the military discipline thing along the way. Yeah, I don't know if it's actually true that 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 most millennials don't work somewhere for more than 2 years. It's definitely true that there is an upward trend in folks moving around, but most employers, at least, their goal is to keep people longer. And if their model is we have to hire 10 to keep 3, they'll do that. But there are very few businesses where it makes sense that we actually have a cutoff where we don't get to use the person anymore after that point. So national service, there are a bunch of interesting proposals to kind of try to do it more on a limited scale, do it like, can you do it more as like a home exchange? I have yet to see one that actually like works, but I think it's a really great idea for people to talk about and engage with. Your question, I think, more sounded like kind of a job guarantee. Like it's essentially sort of a backstop of the government providing public jobs, whether it's as a condition of welfare assistance, whether it's to make them available to people who don't have other work. And job guarantees are, I think, a very, very bad idea. It was actually interesting. I was part of a working group convened with like 8 left of center and 8 right of center folks that Brookings Institution and American Enterprise Institute convened to kind of try to do recommendations for the working class. One of the things we all agreed on was to like put in a couple paragraphs just saying public job guarantee is a terrible idea. We all agree. And there are a few reasons for that. One is that it's just something that government is really bad at. That, you know, it's your question of like, there are lots of things that need to be done, why doesn't government like do them? It turns out that government tends to like fail really miserably when it tries to actually be the service provider. A second concern is that you end up actually crowding out a lot of private industry and employment. So just based on the constraint, it's gonna, right, like it's gonna have to be at a high wage and it's gonna have to be with all these benefits. Now all of a sudden that looks more attractive than the private sector job. The third concern, which doesn't get talked about as much, but I think is actually maybe most important, is that you can't handle the business cycle. You can't think of anything to do that we only need a few 100,000 people doing right now when we're at the top of a business cycle and unemployment is low, but that also we could have 8 million people doing 3 years from now at the depth of a recession, but then also go back to a few 100,000 people doing, right? And so when people try to describe look at all the elderly who need care or like these kinds of things, and then you say like, okay, but we can't handle the swings in a sense. And so while there could be cases where you could say, is there something else like a fixed small program that government could run that would employ certain people in a certain place, maybe. But as a national program, it doesn't really work. The thing to do instead, and this is what this group I described also endorsed, is to subsidize the jobs. And whether you're talking about the broad-based wage subsidy I just have talked about, or something more narrow where you do, you know, for the first 6 months for certain hard-to-employ groups, saying to the private sector, we know this person isn't very productive, we know it's hard to employ this person, we'll pick up, you know, either we'll give you $10,000 if you actually keep them employed for a year, or we'll pick up $4 an hour of their wage, is a much better way to induce the higher level of job creation and job acceptance, but without the crowd out and without the government actually having the obligation for like dealing with the employee on a day-to-day basis. And so I think I think there's fairly broad consensus. Actually, the stimulus program back in 2010 had a good program like this that worked much better than trying to actually offer the job directly. So I think in general, that's the direction that people push. Yeah, so I very intentionally don't mention climate change in the book. It's in a footnote for a reason, but explicitly make a point of not mentioning it to say, to make the point, can we please talk about what to do about this greatest problem facing our country without shoehorning it into a climate change agenda somehow. So one thing I'll say about the Green New Deal is it's just embarrassing. I know I don't mean that as attack on you. There are better climate proposals that are serious. The Green New Deal that was rolled out was like make Mexico pay for the wall without all the nuance. I mean, there's really nothing there to talk about as a policy that you could ever consider implementing. More generally, the question of like, okay, but wouldn't there be a great opportunity here to sort of address climate change as a way of creating jobs and so forth? One part of the answer, and it goes to the job guarantee point more generally, is like, not really. The population of folks who you're trying to kind of bring back into the labor force and invest in turns out just not to overlap very much with the population of folks who like are going to do green energy innovation or even frankly retrofit buildings. And so at the margin there are some places where maybe it would help. But I think the more important bigger picture point is if our goal is to actually do something let's say we did want a public program to create jobs, our focus should be what would be the best public program to create jobs, not, hey, this is an excuse to talk more about climate change policy. And I think we have a really big problem in our discussion of environmental policy in particular, in which we try to sell things as win-wins that are just not win-wins. I mean, the classic example of this is when you're talking about some environmental regulation, and you say like, oh gosh, that sounds like it has a lot of costs. And you get somebody who jumps up and says like, no, actually environmental regulation is good for the economy because it spurs innovation and creates jobs. And you're like, all right, let's just stipulate a world in which we didn't care about the pollution. Like we had a little box here on the table that just cleaned up all the pollution automatically for free. In that world, would you still propose this regulation because it was good for the economy and good for workers? And the answer is no, that obviously not. If you would, like, let's just go make up regulations about other things that we don't care about. In fact, you're only proposing the regulation because you care about the pollution, even though without reference to the pollution, it would not be a good thing for the economy or workers. And then you're trying to so you've got your environmental win, and then you're trying to sort of retroactively sell it as a win for the people who it is not a win for. And I think that has led us toward a lot of really bad trade-offs. So if there are places where, like, yes, the best way to address this population is through a plan that fights climate change, like, I guess we could talk about it, but you'd probably have to sell me on the idea that even if there were no such thing as climate change, this would still be the best plan. And that rarely ends up being the case. So I think it's fine to have a debate about what to do about climate change, and it will probably be costly, and we should talk about when we think those costs are worth incurring and would accomplish something. But I think it does a disservice to our discussion about what to do about the labor market to kind of try to throw them together for political purposes. Sorry, can you speak up a little bit? Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a whole sort of healthcare reform discussion in like for any given amount of money we want to spend, what is the best way to actually get the system working well? I think there's sort of a related question, though. I thought you were going there, maybe you went there a little, of like, to what extent is the provision of healthcare services even the way to produce the best health? And that's part of the problem with all of the funding through the insurance and so forth, is that we have built a healthcare system that doesn't focus on people's health, it focuses on the provision of healthcare services. And one thing you see in the safety net context in particular, and one of the reasons I talk about this idea of shifting money toward something like a wage subsidy, is that you get almost no correlation between how much you spend on healthcare for low-income households and actual health outcomes. I mean, among other things, the states that spend the lowest share of their social services money on healthcare actually have the best health outcomes on virtually every measure you can think of. And there's so much that's way, way, way upstream of the healthcare market that has, I would argue, a much bigger effect on people's health. And that this is one of the things that the consumer welfare frame leads us to and gets wrong, is this idea of like, well, and we'll solve people's healthcare problems by taking some of that GDP and spending it on healthcare for people. And then you look at the communities where health is really in decline, and you say it has nothing to do with access to healthcare and everything to do with access to work and the health, strength of families and communities. And so when you look at, I think we now have 3 straight years of declining life expectancy. I think you have to say, like, we've pursued this set of policies, and environmental regulation has also been a big piece of it. If only we could lower particulate matter by this amount, it would save this many tens of thousands of lives. And then you say, well, okay, but we did. The air is phenomenally cleaner than it was in decades past, but we're actually losing tens of thousands of extra lives because the industrial economy also failed. And that's not to suggest a direct trade-off that if only that it was a trade-off between those two things, but it's to say that what you do to produce happy, healthy people and flourishing communities is a lot more complicated than the kind of cost-benefit analysis and healthcare spending that we've let policy focus on. And I agree with you that if we had much more focus on letting people allocate their own resources instead of saying that everybody had gold-plated insurance, I think that would, first of all, you'd probably have a better healthcare system, but you'd also end up with better health. So I would say in general, the flawed ideas that I described are ones that have dominated the OECD economies, the Western world generally. The flip side is that if you look at the Asian economies that have grown incredibly quickly, they have taken this incredibly producer-focused model and, I would say excessively suppressed consumption and for the sake of investment in production. So that's not to say that the model I'm describing is like, we should be like China. But when you talk about the model of growth that a Japan or a Korea or a Taiwan pursued, it was much more focused on this idea of how do we create industries in which people can work productively instead of how do we maximize consumption. The other thing that I think is important to emphasize is that a lot of things I'm talking about are actually more akin to the way Northern Europe does things. All of our fights, everyone thinks like Bernie Sanders likes Denmark, and that's the opposite of what conservatives like and so forth. On a lot of dimensions, Northern Europe is actually takes a much, much more, what I would say is fundamentally conservative approach to a lot of these issues. So the model of organized labor in Northern Europe looks nothing like what we have here. You don't have this vote in every company or every plant, and then you become a union, and then you negotiate and either strike or don't. Unions are actually institutions in civil society. You join a union because you want to, completely independent of who you work for. And unions and firms can then negotiate but they're looking for arrangements that are actually going to boost productivity, that are to the benefit of the firm and the workers. And so what you often end up with is what's called a works council, which is a group of workers who essentially represent workers within the company or within the facility, but are there to, as a communication mechanism and to look for opportunities to collaborate and to share in management, not to threaten a strike. And when you talk, what you find when you survey workers in the US is that they too would much more prefer that model. When you ask even workers who are members of unions, would you rather have a more adversarial relationship with management but more power, or a cooperative relationship with management and no power? They choose cooperative relationship, no power by 2 or 3 to 1. But that kind of arrangement, is not only do we not have it, it is actually illegal in this country. Our union laws prohibit anything other than a formal union. So that's an example. And the same thing with education. The rest of the world thinks we are crazy with our college for all education thing. In virtually every other developed country, 40 to 70% of secondary school students are tracked into a non-college program. And people in those countries tend to have much better outcomes earlier in their professional lives. Now, interestingly, they have worse outcomes later in life, which isn't necessarily surprising. If you've trained someone to do one particular thing when it's relevant and they're 20, that's going to work out great. If it's no longer relevant and they're 50, that's not going to work out so great. So you have to pair that kind of model with an actual opportunity for continuous learning. But again, those are the kinds of things that the rest of the world does. So I would say on things like trade and immigration, it looks a lot more like the Asian model. On things like education and labor, it looks a lot more like the European model. And then on environment and regulation, it's really important to emphasize what an outlier we are on our environmental standards. I mean, our requirements for essentially safe air quality and the stringency of the Clean Air Act is such that Brussels, the capital of EU, would be the single dirtiest city in the United States. Like that's how far off we are. And then the same thing when you look at like permitting and approval processes. Countries like Australia, Canada, Germany have moved to these systems where it's like 2-year process, sometimes within 6 months, you get a definite decision, no more litigation allowed after it. And we still have our crazy system. And so on those, and certainly, developing economies take a very different approach to environment and permitting and all that. So we're really, I think conceptually, a lot of the Western world has gone down the same track, but in how aggressively we have pursued with our policy, I think we're even an outlier within that group. Yeah, so I don't know, I would have to think more about the substitution effect from the employer side. Substitution effect from the employee side is a very important question, which is essentially if I'm now getting paid more, at what point do I react by therefore working more versus at what point do I react by therefore working less because I've already earned enough money. And for one thing, that's something we have some pretty good data on from the Earned Income Tax Credit in particular, where we don't see people working less because they know they're going to get the tax refund. But more generally, I think that you have to ask the question of sort of over what income level do you think the substitution effect takes hold? So if you're talking about a wage subsidy that's going to fade out to zero by the time you get to $15 an hour, then you're saying a full-time worker earning a significant getting a significant wage subsidy is still earning like $25,000 a year. So at $25,000 a year income, and that's for 40 hours a week, are you really going to start working less than full-time because you would want the substitution even at an income below 25K? I'm not saying there's no one for whom that would be the choice, but that is not the effect you would likely get at that point. What you might get is maybe a second earner who decides they don't also have to work full-time. You might get someone who decides I don't have to take a second job. But the flip side, and one of the nice things about the wage subsidy is it actually encourages you to take a second job. So the problem with a lot of programs, including the Earned Income Tax Credit, is as you earn more money, we phase it out, right? So essentially you're being taxed especially heavily on additional hours that you work. With a wage subsidy, you get the subsidy for every hour that's worked at a low wage. So if you do want to take a second job, if your wife wants to take a job as well, et cetera, you can keep earning the subsidy on every one of those hours. So I think it has less of a substitution effect in that sense than a lot of other programs would. And I think for the range of earners that we're talking about, to the extent that you're getting a substitution effect, it's I don't have to work as much overtime, I don't need a second full-time earner, and not, oh great, I don't even have to be enough of a worker to get the value associated with work. The last question? Oh, this has to be the last question. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so SSI and Medicaid are the worst of all the programs because they're cliffs. You're essentially either in or out. Yeah, well, that's right. And so you have, with SSI, a lot of cases, a huge incentive not to work at all. With Medicaid in particular, you have to keep your earnings under a certain level. Any program, unless you're going to make it a universal program and just give it to everybody, has to phase out somehow. The nice thing about a wage subsidy is that you phase it out on the wage and not on the total income. And so what that means is as I get a raise from $10 an hour to $12 an hour to $14 an hour, I'm going to be getting less subsidy. And once I hit 15, maybe I'm not getting any subsidy. So that creates some disincentives. It means I'm less excited about getting a raise than I otherwise would be. But that's on a different margin than on the question of how much to work. So I'm never penalized for working more hours for taking another job. If I take a second higher paying job, I can still even be earning the subsidy on my first lower paying job. And so because it's just tied to the wage, the only disincentive is with respect to getting raises. And while that does have some weird quirky effects, the nice thing is that other things equal, people like raises. Raises and promotions are goods, and if you're getting less of the dollar value of it than you otherwise would have, that's not ideal, but it's very different than saying, we're going to penalize you for actually working more, which isn't necessarily a good. And so you have to phase out somewhere, and I think phasing out on the wage is a much better way to phase out than phasing out on essentially the amount of work done. Thank you, guys.